The house was quiet but not empty. I froze at the soft click of the back door, the faint shuffle in the hallway above. For a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the security feed told a different story. Shadows moved with purpose, keys jangled where they shouldn't have. My parents, people I trusted more than anyone, were inside my home, in my space, arranging things I wasn't meant to see. I stayed still, heart hammering, realizing how small and unseen I had been all along. They smiled at each other, unaware, confident in their secrecy. And I knew then this was not a mistake. This was a plan. I always arrived home at the same time. The quiet streets on the way in, the soft hum of the heater in the hallway, the faint smell of my mother's soap from the kitchen, it all felt like a rhythm I could rely on. I liked it that way. My life had always been small, contained, predictable. I moved carefully, quietly, not because anyone told me to, but because I had learned early that visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited disappointment. The house itself felt alive with the presence of my parents. Not in an oppressive way, not like a warning sign, but like a background current. My father was methodical. He kept track of everything, his notes tucked into folders I was never meant to see. My mother was warmer in her movements, lighter in her laughter, and yet there was a precision to her gestures, a way she placed items on counters and shelves that seemed casual but always left a trace, a record, a message for someone who knew how to read it. I had learned to read these messages without thinking. Our dinners were predictable. I sat at the end of the table, the spot they always left for me, and watched them speak as though I were invisible. Not in a cruel way, they never meant to hurt me, but their world existed above and beyond me, and I had learned to exist quietly within it. I spoke only when addressed, nodded when they expected it, and learned that silence often revealed more than words. There was a sense of trust in this routine. I trusted that my parents would not cross certain lines, that they would not betray the invisible agreements that bound us together. That trust was not loud or declarative. It lived in small things. The way I could leave my keys on the counter without fear, the way they expected me to be gone at work without checking, the way my possessions remained untouched because they were mine. It was a fragile trust, but it was trust nonetheless, and I held it close. I noticed everything. I noticed how my father's eyes lingered on certain envelopes longer than others, how my mother's hands would pause mid-motion when I entered a room, as if assessing my awareness. These were small things, almost imperceptible, but I remembered them, stored them. They seemed insignificant at the time, mere quirks, habits, the ordinary movements of people I loved and depended on. Even my own habits were measured. I made my bed neatly, prepared my meals in silence, folded my clothes the same way every morning. The order of my world was my shield. It gave me a sense of control, however limited. Within these walls, within this quiet life, I could breathe, observe, and exist without conflict. I felt safe, even though safety was not guaranteed. Safety was a practice, and yet there were cracks, though I didn't recognize them yet. A misplaced note, a glance that seemed too fleeting to catch, a door left slightly ajar that I was certain I had closed. These details did not alarm me at first. They were anomalies, small deviations from the rhythm I knew. My trust in them was stronger than the unease that these small moments whispered. I spent evenings reading, the lamp casting a narrow cone of light over my table. My parents spoke in the other room, their conversation punctuated by laughter and sighs I didn't fully understand. Sometimes I imagined what they discussed when I wasn't there, how their lives intertwined in ways that were always slightly beyond my grasp. I accepted this distance because I believed it was natural. It was not. There were also the routines of the neighborhood, the familiar faces I passed each morning, the shopkeepers who knew my name but not my story. In that world, I was visible and anonymous all at once, a combination that suited me. I like to think that in this quiet, measured life, I was safe from deception, from betrayal. That was the illusion I carried into every corner of this house, every room filled with the echoes of my parents' presence. Trust, I believed, was inherent in the life I led. I believed that love was enough to prevent crossing lines, to maintain boundaries that were understood and respected. I never considered that trust could be misused, that the very people I depended on could see it as a weakness. I lived with my head down, observing, listening, believing that my careful watchfulness was enough to keep the equilibrium intact. But trust, I would learn, is fragile. And sometimes it is most dangerous when it is complete. It started with small things. At first, I didn't even name them as discomfort. A misplaced envelope on the counter, a bill that had been opened before I touched it, the soft hum of conversation that paused abruptly when I entered the room. I chalked it up to coincidence, to forgetfulness, to normal human error. But the feeling lingered, a quiet unease pressing at the edges of my mind. I remember walking past the living room one evening and seeing my father lean over a stack of papers I wasn't meant to notice. He glanced up quickly, his expression shifting in a way that was too fast to interpret. I said nothing. I walked on. There was a part of me that wanted to ask, to confront, but another part, the larger part, knew that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. My mother's behavior was equally subtle. She had a way of laughing too loudly at certain moments, directing her attention in ways that seemed casual but left me feeling like an intruder in my own home. Once I caught her touching the lock on my bedroom door, then pulling her hand back quickly as if it had burned her. She smiled at me and asked what I was reading, and I nodded, said nothing. The unease stayed with me, like the edge of a shadow I couldn't shake. Even the smallest interactions began to feel off. Conversations would start normally, only to veer into strange territory. Questions about my routines, remarks about things I had never shared, hints about knowledge I assumed was private. I would pause, measure my words carefully, respond in ways that revealed nothing. And still, I felt watched. I began to notice patterns in their movements. My father would leave the house at unusual hours, claiming errands or work meetings, and return with pockets lighter, hands emptier. My mother seemed to have a schedule I could not map, vanishing for stretches without explanation. I didn't accuse them. I didn't say anything. I simply cataloged the moments, storing them, comparing them, seeing how they intersected with the life I thought I knew. Sleep became heavier, more fragmented. I woke in the middle of the night to faint noises. The click of a door latch, the rustle of paper, footsteps that paused and retreated when I stirred. The unease was subtle, almost imperceptible in daylight, but at night it grew, feeding on my quiet attentiveness. I found myself lying awake, tracing the shadows across the walls, listening for what was not meant for me. Yet during the day, I forced normalcy. I spoke with my parents in measured tones, smiled when required, kept up the illusion that nothing was wrong. It was easier this way. To act as if the small discomforts were insignificant maintained the fragile trust I had built. To question, to confront, would have broken that trust, perhaps forever. And still, the gnawing sensation persisted. I began testing boundaries silently. I left my belongings in unusual places to see if they moved. I noted conversations I had never intended to eavesdrop on. I traced patterns in emails and letters that passed through my hands. Each anomaly felt like a breadcrumb leading somewhere I wasn't meant to go. Each time I rationalized it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe my imagination was too attentive, too sharp. The feeling of being underestimated grew alongside the discomfort. My parents treated me as if my awareness was limited, my ability to notice insignificant details negligible. That assumption was their armor, my observation was mine. I held my silence like a shield, letting them reveal themselves in their own time. And yet there was fear now mixed with attention, the fear that what I suspected might be true, that the cracks in the normal world I had trusted were wider than I realized. I could not name the danger yet. It had no form, no voice, no definitive proof. It was a presence, a tension in the house, a quiet current beneath the surface of everyday life. But I felt it, and it whispered in every careful movement, every glance I allowed myself, every pause in conversation. Something was wrong. Something was shifting. And though I could not see it fully, I understood deep down that my quiet world, the one I had built on trust and observation, was beginning to fracture. The first time I felt that unmistakable prick of suspicion, it was a document left on the counter, almost casually. My parents had gone out for what they said was an afternoon errand, and the envelope had been slipped between the mail and my own bills. I didn't touch it immediately. I stared, counting the seconds, watching shadows lengthen across the kitchen tiles. Something about the handwriting, precise and deliberate, felt foreign to our usual exchanges. It was not addressed to me, but it wasn't meant to be seen either. I picked it up with a careful hand, turning it over. The edges were worn as though handled multiple times, folded, unfolded, and refolded. My heart thudded in that measured way it always did when the line between normalcy and disruption blurred. I did not open it. I could not. But I memorized its position, the way it leaned against the counter, the subtle pressure in its placement, and the timing of its arrival. Other inconsistencies began to surface. My father, who always kept a meticulous ledger of household expenses, had gaps I hadn't noticed before. Small entries missing, numbers adjusted without explanation. I cross-checked receipts I had kept, noticing discrepancies that could have been coincidence, but coincidence had a pattern too regular to ignore. My unease solidified into a tension. My mother's habits shifted as well. I found cups I had not used in strange positions, lights left on in rooms we never occupied at that hour, and the faint smell of cleaning products where nothing had been cleaned recently. These were small details, almost trivial, but I had learned to notice them. They pressed at the edges of my mind, whispering that something was off, that the house I trusted was no longer a neutral space. I began observing more deliberately. I timed their comings and goings, noted the inflections in their voices during conversations, cataloged the half-smiles and brief glances they exchanged when they believed I wasn't watching. There was a rhythm, subtle yet precise, and in that rhythm I sensed intention. A neighbor mentioned seeing my father near the back gate late one night, when I knew he was supposedly at a meeting. I listened without comment, weighing her words against my observations. My mother called from the market to ask why I hadn't taken the dog for a walk, a routine she never interrupted. I answered calmly, masking the tension I felt as if it were nothing more than ordinary miscommunication. The first red flags were not dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no overt betrayal. There was only the quiet weight of inconsistency, the small, almost invisible deviations from what had always been certain. I noticed how they avoided direct answers to simple questions. I noticed the hesitation in their gestures, the fleeting way my father's hand brushed against a drawer he claimed to have just cleaned. These moments were fleeting, but they were there, undeniable once I had begun to pay attention. I began cataloging evidence silently. Notes, observations, small records of anomalies. Nothing definitive yet, but a mosaic forming slowly, a quiet narrative that contradicted the trust I had placed so completely in them. I understood, without yet naming it, that my parents were no longer simply caregivers. They were actors in a scheme I had yet to comprehend fully. Even my own sense of caution grew sharper. I moved through the house differently, leaving doors slightly ajar to see who would notice, adjusting routines to gauge reaction. I observed how shadows moved across walls in ways that did not align with what should have been. Every subtle shift was data, every minor anomaly a breadcrumb leading somewhere I was not yet ready to confront. And yet I held my restraint. I did not accuse. I did not confront. I observed, quietly, carefully. Every instinct told me that revealing suspicion too early would dissolve the advantage I held simply by noticing. Power, I had learned, was not in reaction. It was in knowledge. And I had begun to gather it, piece by piece, red flag by red flag, under the calm surface of my quiet world. By the end of that week, I could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. The small moments, taken together, formed a lattice of suspicion. The unease I had first felt as a whisper had grown into a persistent hum. I knew, even then, that something in the house had shifted irreversibly, and I was no longer merely an observer in a familiar world. I began to voice small questions, carefully phrased, designed to test boundaries without confrontation. "I thought I saw something in the mail," I said one afternoon, my voice steady, measured. My father looked at me as though I had said something absurd, a shadow crossing his face for a fraction of a second before his usual calm returned. "You must be imagining things," he said lightly, turning his attention back to his work as if my words had no weight, no substance, no right to exist. My mother joined in the pattern subtly, without overt malice. "You're reading too much into it," she said once, smoothing a hand over a stack of letters I knew I hadn't touched. Her smile was soft, almost tender, but beneath it there was a calculation, an insistence that my perception was faulty. I nodded. I said nothing further. Silence was my shield, but it did not shield me from the pressure building around me. The gaslighting became more precise. When I mentioned minor inconsistencies, receipts that didn't match their explanations, small objects that had been moved, the response was always the same: disbelief. "That's impossible," my father said, voice low but firm. "You must be remembering it wrong." My mother would add a quiet laugh, as if the very idea of me noticing such details were laughable. They painted me as careless, inattentive, even unstable. I felt my own mind strain under the weight of doubt. Was I seeing things? Was I misremembering? The quiet voice in my head that had catalogued anomalies, patterns, inconsistencies, whispered that I was not. Yet every assertion I made was met with calm dismissal, eroding confidence with each encounter. The house I trusted seemed to shift beneath me, not physically, but in its reality, slightly altered, subtly warped, as though my observations had no claim to truth. Even friends outside the house began to notice the strain in me. A casual conversation with a coworker turned awkward when I spoke of my unease. "Maybe you're overthinking," they said gently, but with conviction, a mirror of the dismissals I received at home. The subtle pressure of consensus, of shared disbelief, weighed on me, though I never let it break me completely. I was careful, observant, quietly resistant. My parents escalated in subtle ways. Doors I had locked were left unlocked, keys moved, objects placed in locations I knew were not theirs. When I questioned them, they responded with irritation disguised as concern. "Why are you so suspicious all the time?" my mother asked one evening, her tone calm, almost worried. "You're letting your imagination run wild." My father nodded, adding, "We just want you to relax. You're taking things too seriously." The quietest forms of cruelty were often the hardest to name. Meals left unfinished for no reason. A favorite chair subtly shifted to a less comfortable spot. Small gestures of exclusion that, when observed in isolation, seemed trivial, but collectively formed a landscape of disregard. I cataloged each one, storing them, noting their recurrence, seeing the invisible patterns in the ordinary acts of life. I began noticing how my body reacted before my mind even processed the incidents. A tightening in my chest, a shallow inhale, the subtle flare of adrenaline when I realized an object had been moved again. I could feel my own restraint building, a careful equilibrium maintained to avoid giving them any satisfaction in seeing my recognition of their control. Every small act of invalidation, every subtle mockery, became a measure of power they thought they wielded, and of patience I was cultivating silently. Even my own reactions were scrutinized. My quiet observation became a source of tension in the house, though they refused to acknowledge it. They mocked my attentiveness in ways that were imperceptible to outsiders. A glance exchanged when I wasn't looking, a half smile that carried condescension. I felt them testing my limits, probing the edges of my awareness. I remained still, my mind cataloging, my eyes observing, my emotions restrained. By the end of the chapter, I realized that the house itself had turned against me, not through walls or locks, but through manipulation and careful dismissal. The reality I had trusted, built on quiet observation and assumed safety, was no longer mine to inhabit fully. My parents had learned how to make me doubt myself, how to twist perception without ever speaking a lie directly. And still, I held my silence. I did not argue. I did not confront. I did not show that I understood the pattern, that I saw the manipulation for what it was. My restraint was deliberate, the only power I could claim in a house where even trust had become a weapon. The quietest, heaviest truth was forming in me. To be heard or to be safe, I had to remain unseen. It started with the small things I could no longer ignore. A flash of movement on the security camera feed, a shadow that didn't belong, a door left slightly ajar when I knew I had closed it. I watched quietly, recording, cataloging, storing evidence in the back of my mind, careful not to let my parents suspect that I had begun to see beyond the surface. One evening, I noticed it clearly for the first time. My father, carrying a set of my house keys in his hand, moving with deliberate steps I had never seen him take before. My heart beat, but I remained still, silent, hidden behind the doorframe. He did not know I was watching, and the confidence in his movements betrayed his awareness of secrecy. My mother appeared shortly after, matching his steps, each movement coordinated, each action precise. The realization hit me with a weight I couldn't speak of aloud. This was not a mistake. This was a plan. I began checking the security recordings more methodically. There were gaps, moments where the cameras had been turned or redirected, subtle enough to pass unnoticed by anyone less attentive than I was. I memorized each second, each pause, each movement. Patterns emerged. Small interactions like the brushing of hands across counters or the shifting of furniture were no longer trivial. They became pieces of a puzzle, a partial map of a betrayal unfolding quietly in my own home. A neighbor, someone I had known casually for years, provided an unexpected perspective. "I saw your father," she said one morning, "moving boxes into your backyard shed. Didn't seem like work, more like planning." She glanced away quickly, as if speaking even these few words risked consequences she could not name. I nodded, thanked her, but said nothing else. I did not need confirmation in conversation. Her observation was merely a corroboration of what I had already begun to piece together in silence. Evidence began to present itself in other forms. Receipts, previously overlooked, were subtly misplaced in my father's files. Bills I had opened earlier appeared again, shuffled into different envelopes, as though someone had attempted to erase the original record. I traced them carefully, noticing patterns that suggested intent rather than carelessness. Every anomaly added to the quiet certainty forming inside me. I observed my mother in similar ways. She would linger near rooms she had no reason to enter, her hands brushing surfaces as if measuring, cataloging, arranging. Once I noticed a small piece of paper tucked under a book, a note that I knew was not hers. The handwriting was deliberate, practiced, and the message, though partial, suggested coordination. My pulse quickened, but my voice remained silent. I had learned to let knowledge accumulate quietly, unseen. Even the subtle reactions of others began to support my growing awareness. My parents' interactions with distant relatives shifted. There were phone calls I overheard, conversations paused mid-sentence when I entered the room. My mother's laughter sometimes carried a note of nervousness, quickly masked, but it was there. My father's sighs were measured, almost imperceptible, but precise in timing, revealing tension behind his composed exterior. These small moments reinforced what I already knew. The cracks in their normal world were intentional, and I had begun to see them. I did not confront them. I did not speak of what I had discovered. I understood that partial exposure carried risk. To act too soon could ruin the advantage I now held simply by observing, cataloging, and understanding. I moved more deliberately through the house, noting every gesture, every subtle change in routine. The air itself seemed charged, thick with intent I could feel but could not yet name aloud. The quietest moments were the most telling. I would pass a room and catch a glimpse of a hand adjusting a frame on the wall, or a shadow that did not match its source. I began keeping mental records of these fragments, comparing them, connecting them, seeing the shape of something larger forming beneath the surface of ordinary life. The betrayal was no longer hypothetical. It had substance, form, and intent. By the end of the week, I had enough to understand that this was not a secret I could ignore. My parents were attempting to manipulate the very foundation of my home, to shift ownership and control without ever acknowledging my presence. And yet, the full scope was still beyond me. I could see parts, pieces, fragments of truth, but the complete picture had not yet revealed itself. Still, I remained restrained. I did not react, did not confront, did not allow my emotions to betray my awareness. I had learned that in this house, power was not declared, it was observed. My role was not to act yet, but to witness, to record, and to prepare. The quiet accumulation of evidence, the careful observation of inconsistencies became my form of control. It was subtle, invisible, but effective. And in that quiet space, amidst the shadows and the half-seen movements, I began to understand the truth. Trust had been broken long before the betrayal fully revealed itself. What I had lived in until now, the rhythm, the calm, the trust, was already compromised. I had begun to see the threads of their plan, and I knew the moment of revelation was approaching. The air in the house changed that week. Not dramatically, not with shouting or confrontation, but in a way that set every instinct on edge. I could feel it the moment I stepped through the front door. A subtle tension, the way my parents moved, the faint stiffness in their shoulders, the deliberate pacing of their steps. They knew I had begun to see, or at least suspect, the edges of their plan. And they were testing how far they could push before I broke. It began with small provocations. Items I knew were mine were subtly shifted, placed just out of reach or in inconvenient locations. I would notice, pause, and adjust without comment. The purpose was clear: to gauge my reaction, to unsettle me without leaving evidence of malice. My restraint became both shield and weapon. I refused to react, refused to give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement, while my eyes observed every detail. Conversations took on new undertones. My father asked questions with hidden meanings, casually inquiring about schedules, routines, and possessions. My mother's words carried double layers. On the surface, they were benign, but beneath them lay insinuation, a probing of knowledge and awareness. I answered in measured tones, keeping my voice calm, my words neutral, revealing nothing, yet cataloging everything. Each exchange became a test of patience, a silent battle I could not afford to lose. I noticed the coordination between them. Doors opened and closed in sequences, notes shifted between rooms, objects subtly moved to mark territory. It was no longer passive manipulation. It was deliberate, synchronized action. They were accelerating their plan, responding to the awareness they must have sensed in me. And I realized that the stakes had changed. What had once been subtle discomfort was now a calculated escalation. One evening, I found my father in the study, papers spread across the desk in a way that demanded attention. I did not approach. I watched from the doorway, noting the movement of his hands, the slight crease of his brow, the tension in his jaw. He lifted a document, glanced toward the hallway as if checking for my presence, and replaced it with another. My pulse quickened, but I remained still. Observation was my only response. The moment to act had not yet arrived. My mother escalated as well. She began questioning my routines more directly, noting absences or deviations with a calm, almost clinical tone. "You didn't do this yesterday," she said one evening, her voice soft but precise. "Are you sure you're keeping track?" I answered with a nod, keeping my tone even. Every word, every gesture, every pause was recorded in my mind, stored like evidence for the moment when clarity would arrive. The psychological pressure was palpable. I felt it in the tightening of my chest, in the subtle rise of adrenaline, in the careful calculation of each movement I made. Their escalation was a test. Could they destabilize me, make me doubt my perception, force me into reaction before I had the full picture? I had learned too much to give them that power. Silence remained my strongest tool, my quietest weapon. Even my external life reflected the tension. Tasks that had once been routine now carried weight. Each interaction, each movement outside the house was measured. I found myself noting patterns, collecting small confirmations from the world beyond, every bit of observation sharpening my understanding of what was happening within my own walls. The house had become a pressure cooker, and I was both witness and participant, caught in a web of strategy I had not created but was beginning to understand. Then came the first overt sign of anger, subtle but undeniable. My father slammed a drawer shut after noticing my presence near the desk. My mother's voice, normally calm and modulated, carried a slight edge when she remarked on misplaced objects. These were the first cracks in their composed exterior, the first evidence that my quiet observation had begun to unnerve them. I took note, storing each sign for the inevitable moment when consequences would crystallize. I began arranging my own subtle countermeasures. I left items deliberately where they could be seen, but not touched, noting the patterns of attention, testing their responses. I adjusted my own schedule to gauge reaction, seeing how the space and timing of my movements affected their behavior. Every small act was a probe, a quiet exertion of awareness, a preparation for the moment when clarity would demand action, or at least acknowledgement. The tension escalated beyond minor disruptions. I began to notice financial records being accessed without explanation, small transfers or alterations in files that were not mine to change. My parents' confidence had shifted. They were no longer careful. Their movements were precise, yes, but increasingly urgent, as if aware that their plan might be exposed. I cataloged each instance, each deviation, noting the careful layering of intent, the subtle power they were exerting. By the end of the week, it was undeniable. The quiet unease of the past months had grown into a tangible escalation. I no longer needed to wonder if something was wrong. They had revealed themselves through movement, gesture, and behavior. The stakes had risen. My parents' plan was unfolding, and my observation had become an active form of resistance. Every glance, every note, every object shifted in the house told a story. I was finally seeing it, and the next moments would determine how much of the truth I could preserve, and how much they could still control. I had reached the point where the weight of knowing became almost unbearable. Every step I took in the house felt charged with anticipation. Every glance over my shoulder, a reminder of the subtle but relentless presence of my parents' intentions. I could no longer ignore what I had seen, what I had catalogued, the careful orchestration of my own home being stripped from me without confrontation, without acknowledgement. And yet I did not act. I did not yell. I did not demand explanation. I had learned that restraint was the only form of power left to me. The realization came slowly, in fragments. I sat at the kitchen table one evening, a faint hum of the heater in the background, and traced the sequence of events I had observed over the past months. Keys moved, papers shifted, doors left unlocked or opened without reason. Conversations that had seemed ordinary now revealed layers of meaning, coded gestures and glances that had passed unnoticed by anyone else. My parents had built a lattice of deception so delicate, so precise, that only someone paying attention could see it. I had been paying attention. Anger flared briefly, hot and consuming, but I let it pass. It would have been easy to confront, to demand, to show them that I knew. But I understood, at a deeper level, that doing so would only hand them the victory. To react would prove their power, validate their control, and perhaps accelerate the very betrayal I had been quietly resisting. Restraint, however, allowed me to preserve the advantage of observation. I could see more than they realized. I could hold them accountable in ways they would never anticipate. I began to calculate the moral cost of exposure. If I revealed everything, if I forced acknowledgement, what would it achieve? Immediate confrontation would fracture our relationships irreparably, but restraint allowed the truth to exist independently of my actions. I could bear the psychological burden, catalog the evidence, and watch consequences unfold naturally. I realized, with a cold clarity, that sometimes justice did not require voice, and truth did not require audience. The quiet moments became unbearable in their intensity. Sitting in my room, hearing my parents move through the house with assumed secrecy, I felt the psychological weight pressing against me. I imagined the conversations they would have, the plans they must have made, the small, deliberate manipulations they executed daily. Each thought drew a tight knot in my chest. But I remained calm, carefully breathing through the rising tension. My restraint became a practice, a necessary armor, a way to survive without capitulating. I noticed how their confidence had begun to falter, though subtly. My father hesitated over papers, my mother glanced too long at certain spaces before moving on. Even in their attempts to maintain composure, cracks appeared. I cataloged them, stored them in memory, observed without acknowledgement. It was enough to know that the equilibrium had shifted. I had reached a moral breaking point not because I wanted revenge, not because I desired confrontation, but because I had recognized the full extent of betrayal and understood my own role in witnessing it. Sleep offered no escape. I lay awake tracing their movements, replaying interactions in my mind, noting inconsistencies, collecting fragments of evidence like a silent ledger of deceit. My restraint extended beyond action. It had seeped into thought, emotion, and even dreams. I realized I could not trust the patterns of ordinary life anymore. I had to trust only my own observation, my own ability to see what was hidden. And yet, the emotional breaking point was not in anger. It was in the quiet acknowledgement of cost. I understood that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. The life I had led, carefully constructed and measured, had been infiltrated by those I depended on most. The recognition was devastating, but it demanded neither outcry nor confrontation. I accepted the loss with precision, understanding that patience, observation, and subtlety were my only recourse. By the end of that week, I had made my choice. I would not react impulsively. I would not confront. I would not beg or plead. Instead, I would continue to observe, to record, and to prepare. Every moment of restraint was a conscious act of power, every silence a declaration of awareness. I had reached my breaking point not through despair, but through understanding. The betrayal was complete, but my response would be measured, quiet, deliberate. I realized in the stillness of that evening that power in this house was never loud. It was never expressed in words or confrontation. It was revealed in observation, in witness, in the careful accumulation of truth that could not be erased. My parents believed themselves in control. I knew better. And in the quiet of that realization, I found a grim, necessary strength. The moment of undeniable consequence arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, but with a weight that could not be ignored. I had not confronted them, had not accused, had not shouted or demanded acknowledgement. Yet the systems they thought they controlled began to expose themselves, revealing every careful manipulation, every subtle lie, and every calculated step meant to undermine me. It started with a simple email notification. A digital record I had been monitoring for months. A transfer of ownership documents, partially signed, partially hidden, was sent to the wrong address. My father had intended secrecy, precision, control. Instead, the system itself, indifferent to their plans, revealed the attempt. I saw it first, silently, and the weight of the truth pressed against my chest. My parents had attempted to give my house to my brother, and they had failed to account for the mechanisms that governed the process. I watched them closely that evening. Their calm facades remained in place, but subtle cracks appeared. My mother's hand lingered on the counter a moment too long. My father's eyes flicked toward the documents, as if seeking confirmation I had already claimed. They were unaware that I had seen everything, cataloged everything, stored every detail for the future, even as I made no move to confront them directly. The consequences of their actions were beginning to manifest independently of my involvement. Witnesses, too, began to surface in small, quiet ways. The neighbor who had once remarked on boxes in the shed mentioned, almost casually, that she had seen documents being moved, that certain conversations didn't match what they had been told. I did not correct her, nor did I emphasize the importance. I simply noted it, letting corroboration accumulate without interference. Every small observation, every half-spoken acknowledgement reinforced the inevitability of exposure. Financial systems added their own pressure. Errors in the ledgers, mismatched signatures, misdirected communications, all the things my parents had assumed could be controlled, began to create complications for them. The attempt to transfer ownership without proper authorization created a chain reaction they could not stop. I remained quiet, noting the details, recording the impact, understanding that power could be revealed not through confrontation, but through consequence. Even within the house, subtle shifts made the reality undeniable. Rooms I had once entered freely now bore traces of hurried adjustments, misplaced items, hastily removed documents. These small remnants spoke louder than words. I traced the patterns, connected the fragments, and the picture of their betrayal became unmistakable. The consequences of their decisions were unfolding before them, in ways that could not be denied or redirected. I maintained my calm. No outbursts, no dramatic gestures, no vindictive declarations. The truth was self-evident. Their careful coordination had failed because systems, witnesses, and the meticulous observation I had maintained allowed the reality of their actions to surface independently. I had done nothing overt, and yet the weight of consequence rested squarely on them. The psychological effect was subtle but clear. I noticed the tension in their interactions, the micro pauses, the tentative gestures, the fleeting glances that carried unease they could not hide. They realized, without being told, that their plan had been thwarted, that the house could not be transferred without acknowledgement of my role, that their assumptions of control had been overestimated. The imbalance of power had shifted quietly, irreversibly. I felt no triumph. There was no celebration, no gloating, no sense of revenge. What remained was a quiet, heavy acknowledgement of truth. The house was still mine, intact, the attempted betrayal revealed through mechanisms I had anticipated and observed. My parents' intent had been nullified, not by confrontation, but by the inevitable unfolding of their own miscalculations. As the evening faded, I moved through the house with the same quiet restraint I had maintained for months. Every document, every subtle sign of manipulation had been accounted for. I understood the psychological cost this truth imposed on them, the erosion of confidence and certainty they had once wielded. And I understood my own cost as well, the months of vigilance, observation, restraint, and silent suffering. The consequences were clear, undeniable, and quietly devastating. The betrayal had been revealed. Power in its truest form had shifted, not through noise or reaction, but through observation, systems, and consequence. The house remained mine, and the truth, once hidden beneath layers of careful deception, now existed in the open, heavy, inevitable, and unalterable. The house felt different after that. Not triumphant, not victorious, but changed in a way that could not be undone. My parents moved through the rooms with careful deliberation, their silence carrying the weight of acknowledgement they would not voice. The tension lingered, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. I had learned to see it in their gestures, the way they avoided certain glances, the precise pacing of their steps. I did not gloat. I did not confront. I did not demand apologies or explanations. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to say. The betrayal had been revealed, the consequences had manifested, and the house remained under my quiet stewardship. All that remained was the calm, heavy reality of what had transpired. I moved through the rooms with deliberate stillness, observing the remnants of their attempts to control, the subtle traces of deception that lingered like shadows along the walls. Each one was a reminder of what I had endured, and of the quiet power I had maintained through restraint and observation. My parents' intentions, once hidden and carefully orchestrated, now existed in the open, exposed by their own actions and the mechanisms of reality they had overlooked. The quiet was not comforting. It was heavy, laden with the psychological cost of months spent watching, calculating, and waiting. Trust had been broken irrevocably. The familiarity of the house remained, but the innocence of that trust had vanished. I understood in that stillness that life would continue, but the weight of what had been revealed would linger, quietly shaping every interaction, every gesture, every unspoken word. And so I remained, silent and observant, carrying the burden of knowledge without expression, letting the calm of consequence settle into the fabric of our lives. There was no spotlight, no audience, no applause, only the quiet aftermath, measured, heavy, and complete. The truth had unfolded. The betrayal had been witnessed. And nothing more needed to be said.